It has been almost 1 year since Air India 171 crashed after takeoff from Ahmedabad. 1 year. And still, the biggest question remains. What really happened in those few seconds after liftoff? A Boeing 787 took off on what should have been a normal flight to London Gatwick. The full runway was available, the aircraft was within weight limits, the weather was not the villain, the pilots were qualified, and then, within seconds, both engines lost thrust. The aircraft barely had time to climb. The crew barely had time to react. And before the final answers came, the world had already started building its own story. Some said aircraft failure, some said system issue, some said pilot action. But today, I don't want to start with blame. I want to start with the timeline. Because in aviation, one missing second can change the whole story. I want to revisit the preliminary report and the public narrative that followed. Not because I want to give a final verdict today. I don't. But because the preliminary report gave us some very important facts, and it also left some very important gaps. And when a report leaves gaps, people fill those gaps. Sometimes with questions, sometimes with theories, and sometimes with blame. This is what worries me, because this accident lasted barely half a minute. And in a half-minute accident, every second matters. Let's go step by step. Before we begin, one thing is important. This was a preliminary report. A preliminary report is not a final judgment. It is not a courtroom order. The purpose of accident investigation is to prevent future accidents, not to create a public trial. First, we will walk through the known facts, and then we will look at the questions. And after that, I will tell you what I feel as someone who has spent 23 years in the cockpit. Fair? Let's begin. Air India 171 was operating from Ahmedabad to London Gatwick. The aircraft was a Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner, registration Victor Tango Alpha November Bravo. There were 230 passengers, 10 cabin crew, and 2 pilots on board. The captain was 56 years old. He had more than 15,600 hours of total flying experience. Around 8,600 hours on the Boeing 787. That's a lot. The first officer was 32 years old with more than 3,400 hours total, including over 1,100 hours on the 787. The report says the pilots had adequate rest, they underwent pre-flight breathalyzer test, and were found fit to operate. The first officer was pilot flying, the captain was pilot monitoring. That means the first officer was handling the flying duties while the captain was monitoring, cross-checking, and managing the overall safety of the flight. Fuel on board was 54,200 kilograms. Takeoff weight was within the allowed limit. There were no dangerous goods on board. The crew had asked for the full runway. The aircraft used the full runway. So up to this point, nothing looks abnormal enough to explain what was about to happen. It looked like a routine departure. And this is what makes the next 32 seconds so important. Now listen carefully, because this is where the whole story begins. At 7:49:12 seconds UTC, ATC asked whether the aircraft required the full length of runway 23. The aircraft confirmed that it did. At 08:07:33 seconds UTC, takeoff clearance was issued. At 08:07:37 seconds UTC, the aircraft started rolling. The calculated takeoff speeds were V1 153 knots, VR 155 knots, V2 162 knots. For non-aviators, let me quickly explain this. V1 is a decision speed. Before V1, depending on the failure, you may still reject the takeoff. After V1, you are committed. You go flying. Simply because you won't have enough runway left to stop. Or even if you do, your brakes can catch fire. VR is rotation speed. This is when the pilot starts lifting the nose. Now, according to the flight recorder data, the aircraft crossed V1 and achieved 153 knots indicated airspeed at 08:08:33 seconds UTC. It achieved VR 155 knots indicated airspeed at 08:08:35 seconds UTC. The aircraft's air-ground sensors transitioned to air mode consistent with liftoff at 08:08:39 seconds UTC. So 4 seconds after the nose was lifted, the main gear also got lifted. 4 seconds is exactly the time it takes from rotation to liftoff for a 787 with both engines working properly. Then the aircraft achieved its maximum recorded airspeed of 180 knots IAS at about 080842 seconds UTC. So let's place that clearly. Takeoff roll starts at 080737 seconds. V1 comes at 080833 seconds. VR comes at 080835 seconds. Liftoff comes at 080839 seconds. Maximum recorded speed comes at about 080842 seconds. Till here, the aircraft is accelerating, it has lifted off, it has reached 180 knots. And then the mystery begins. The preliminary report says that immediately after reaching the maximum recorded airspeed, Engine 1 and Engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transition from run to cutoff, one after another, with a gap of 1 second. This is the line that changed the public conversation. This is the line that became the headline. Because if you read it quickly, it sounds very simple. The aircraft took off, the fuel switches went to cutoff, both engines lost thrust, the aircraft crashed. That sounds like a clean story. But aviation accidents are rarely that clean. The report says the switches transition, but it does not clearly answer why. It does not clearly answer who. It does not clearly explain intent. It does not release the full cockpit conversation. It only says one of the pilot is heard asking the other, why did he cut off? The other pilot responded that he did not do so. And still, this one line became enough for many people to start building a blame story. Now, I'm not saying we ignore that line. It is a very serious line. But we cannot pull out one sentence and ignore the rest of the timeline, because the rest of the timeline is where the doubt begins. The first big question is this: what happened first? Did the fuel switches move first and then the engines lost thrust? Or had something already started going wrong with the engines before the switch transition became the headline? This is not a small question. This is the question. Because the aircraft achieved its maximum recorded airspeed of 180 knots at about 080842 seconds. That is 3 seconds after it lifted off. Maximum means after that it did not go faster. Now think about it simply. You are driving a car at 100 kilometers per hour. You are accelerating. Suddenly, the car engine is shut. The car does not instantly start reducing its speed from 100 kilometers per hour. There is momentum. So it reaches a speed couple of notches more than 100 kilometers per hour, then reduces. Just science. Aircrafts are the same. If the aircraft reached maximum speed at about 080842 seconds, then the final report must explain exactly when thrust started reducing. At what second did N1 begin reducing? At what second did N2 begin reducing? Did one engine show abnormality before the other? Did both engines reduce together? Was the engine power normal until the switches moved? Or had the loss of thrust already started before that? This is why words like immediately after are not enough. In daily life, immediately is fine. In aviation accident investigation, immediately can be the difference between cause and consequence. And that difference changes everything. Now let's talk about the RAT, the ram air turbine. For non-aviators, think of it like an emergency windmill. It is a backup power source. It is not something you normally see in a routine takeoff. It comes out when the aircraft needs emergency power. The preliminary report says CCTV footage showed the RAT getting deployed during the initial climb immediately after takeoff. It also says that both engines' N2 value passed below minimum idle speed and the RAT hydraulic pump began supplying hydraulic power at about 080847 seconds UTC. Now look at the timing. Liftoff, 080839 seconds. Maximum recorded airspeed, 080842 seconds. RAT hydraulic power, about 080847 seconds. As per all documentations, the RAT takes 6 to 8 seconds to achieve the maximum pressure for it to provide hydraulic power. That gives us a hint that both the engines might have failed 1 to 2 seconds after liftoff. Now, Safety Matters Foundation has publicly raised the timing question based on frame-by-frame CCTV analysis. Their claim, as I understand, is that the rat may have been visible earlier than the way many people are reading the official sequence. Let me be very clear. This is not the final official finding. CCTV analysis has limitations. Camera angle matters, frame rate matters, timestamp matching matters, image clarity matters. So I'm not saying this proves everything, but it raises a serious question. If the rat was already out before the fuel switch cutoff event, or if the aircraft had already sensed a major power issue before that point, then the story changes. Then we must ask, did the aircraft lose power first? Did the rat deploy because the aircraft had already detected that loss? And did the fuel switch transition happen after the aircraft was already in trouble? I'm not giving a final answer. I'm saying the final report must answer this clearly, because the rat timing is not a side detail. It may be central to understanding the accident sequence. Now here is the part that does not get enough attention. The report does not only say the switches went to cutoff, it also says they came back to run. Engine 1 fuel cutoff switch transitioned from cutoff to run at about 08:08:52 seconds UTC. The APU inlet door began opening at about 08:08:54 seconds UTC, consistent with APU auto start logic. The engine 2 fuel cutoff switch transitioned from cutoff to run at about 08:08:56 seconds UTC. Now think about that. If you only read the first part, switches went to cutoff, it sounds very serious. Of course it does. But when you read the second part, switches came back to run, the picture becomes more complicated. Because when fuel control switches are moved from cutoff to run in flight, FADEC manages the relight and thrust recovery sequence. And the report says EGT was rising for both engines, indicating relight. Engine 1's core deceleration stopped, reversed, and started moving toward recovery. Engine 2 was able to relight but could not arrest core speed deceleration. So now ask yourself, if this was a simple deliberate attempt to bring the aircraft down, why restore the switches to run? Why allow relight? Why would the system begin recovery? Why would the crew still be fighting the aircraft? Again, I'm not saying this alone proves the final cause, but it definitely makes a simple pilot blame story much less simple. Because an action that looks suspicious in isolation may look very different when seen as part of an emergency recovery sequence. In fact, let's look at the pilot's procedure during a dual engine fail. You can see clearly that when both engines fail, pilots are supposed to cut off the fuel control switches and then turn them back on again, which is what the report says. Now let's talk about the cockpit voice recording. The report says one pilot asked the other why he cut off. The other pilot responded that he did not do so. Obviously, that sounds serious. Nobody can deny that. But here is the problem. A full CVR transcript is not public. The report does not identify who said what. It does not give the full conversation. It does not give the exact surrounding context. It gives us a short exchange. And from that short exchange, people started building a full story. But cockpit conversations during emergencies are not neat dialogues written for a movie. They are urgent, they are broken, sometimes they are diagnostic, sometimes one pilot is reacting to what the instruments are showing. Sometimes a question is not an accusation. Sometimes it is a confusion. Sometimes it is one pilot trying to understand what the aircraft is doing. So one line without full context cannot become a dead pilot's trial. If the final report later gives the full context, we will examine it. But until then, this one incomplete cockpit line cannot carry the entire weight of blame. At about 08:09:05 seconds UTC, one of the pilots transmitted, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." The EAFR, or the Enhanced Airborne Flight Recorder, stopped recording at 08:09:11 seconds UTC. So the Mayday call came around 6 seconds before the recording ended. Now some people may ask, why only Mayday? Why not a long explanation? Because that is not how it works. In the cockpit, especially at low altitude, especially just after takeoff, especially during a severe emergency, the priority is simple. Aviate, navigate, communicate. First fly the aircraft, then manage where it is going, then communicate. You don't give a speech when the aircraft is falling, you fly, you try to recover, you call when you can. So when I hear that a Mayday call was made 6 seconds before the end, I don't see a crew sitting back and doing nothing. I see a crew still following procedure, still trying to alert ATC, still fighting. That matters. The report also mentions that impact marks indicated a likely nose-up attitude of about 8 degrees with wings level. Now, again, this does not prove everything, but as a pilot, attitude tells a story. If an aircraft is nose up and wings level close to impact, it suggests someone was still trying to control it, someone was still flying it, someone was still trying to manage the final seconds. If the aim was simply to dive the aircraft into the ground, is that the picture we expect? Maybe the final report will explain it differently. Fine. But today, based on what we have, this is another point that does not comfortably fit into a simple, deliberate action story. Fuel switches back to run, relight attempt, mayday call, nose up attitude. These are not random details. These are pieces of the same puzzle. Now, many people say these switches cannot move accidentally. And yes, normally these switches are designed to prevent accidental movement. They have a locking feature. You don't just brush against them and move them. But the report itself mentions a 2018 FAA Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin about potential disengagement of the fuel control switch locking feature on some Boeing aircraft. The report says the concern was not considered unsafe enough to require a mandatory airworthiness directive. It also says the fuel control switch design, including the locking feature, is similar on various Boeing aircraft models, and the relevant part number was fitted on Victor Tango Alpha November Bravo, the crash aircraft. Air India said the suggested inspections were not carried out because the bulletin was advisory, not mandatory. Let me be very careful here. I am not saying this caused the crash. I am not saying the locking mechanism failed. But if the whole argument is that the switches could only move by deliberate human action, then the condition and behavior of that locking mechanism becomes very important. The final report must clearly answer, was it functioning exactly as designed? Could the switch state have been affected by any mechanical or electrical issue? Was this definitely physical movement, or was it a recorded state that needs deeper interpretation? These are not conspiracy questions. These are basic investigation questions. Now, this is where the story stops being only technical, because behind terms like fuel cutoff, pilot action, human factor, and mental state, there is a family. Captain Sumit Sabharwal's father gave an interview to Barkha, and what he said was painful. He said two investigators came to condole him from the probe panel, and then one of them allegedly said that his son had suicidal tendency. Just imagine that. You have lost your son. You're still trying to understand what happened. And someone from the investigation side, according to the father, says something like this before the final answers are public. He said it hurt him like hell. And then he remembered his last conversation with his son. His son had told him, "Papa, I'm going for the flight and I'll call you from Gatwick." His father wished him all the best. Take care of your flight. Those were his last words with his son. Now think about that for a second. When people casually say, maybe he did it, maybe he was depressed, maybe he brought the aircraft down, they are not just discussing a theory, they are putting a dead man on trial, a man who cannot defend himself, and they are making his family live with a suspicion that has not been proven. This is why evidence matters. This is why language matters. This is why preliminary reports must be extremely precise, because unclear words do not stay on paper. It enters homes, it enters families, it hurts people. And then this matter reached the Supreme Court. Captain Sabharwal's father, along with the Federation of Indian Pilots, sought a fair, transparent, technically robust investigation. The Supreme Court issued notice to the Centre and the DGCA. But what stood out was the court said to the father. The court reportedly told him that nobody can blame his son for anything, that he should not carry the burden on himself. The court also reportedly criticized the kind of reporting that pointed fingers at the pilot, especially foreign media narratives, calling it nasty reporting. Now, I'm not saying a court remark is an accident investigation finding. It is not. But it shows something important. Even at that level, there was a concern about how quickly the pilot was being blamed in public discussion. That is exactly my point. The final report should answer technical questions, not media narratives, not emotional pressure, not unnamed sources, technical questions. What happened first? What failed first? What did the crew see? What did the aircraft record? What did the systems do? And why did the aircraft not recover? Now let's step back, look at the pattern. The aircraft crossed V1 at 153 knots, it rotated at 155 knots, it lifted off at 0808 39 seconds. It reached maximum recorded speed of 180 knots at about 0808 42 seconds. Then the fuel switches are recorded going to cutoff. Then the RAT is supplying hydraulic power by about 0808 47 seconds. Then the switches come back to run. Then relight begins. Then Mayday is called. Then the recording stops. The aircraft impacts with a likely nose-up attitude. The full CVR transcript is not public. The report does not identify who said what. An independent analysis has raised questions about RAT timing. The captain's father says investigators raised a deeply painful mental health suggestion. The Supreme Court later had to reassure the father that no one can blame his son. Now tell me honestly, does this sound like a simple story? Does this sound like a case where we can casually say, pilot did it and move on? For me, no. There are too many missing seconds, too many unanswered questions, too many signs of recovery, too much incomplete context. And this is where my view becomes clear. Not because I want to defend anyone blindly, not because pilots cannot make mistakes. Pilots can make mistakes. Pilots are human. But when you accuse someone of deliberately shutting down both engines seconds after liftoff, you need extraordinary evidence, not assumptions, not unnamed sources, not a short cockpit line without full context, not a preliminary report being treated like the final truth. Now I'll tell you what I feel. Going by the facts available in the preliminary report and going by the unanswered questions around the timeline, I find it very difficult to accept the simple pilot blame narrative. I'm not saying the final report cannot change the picture. It can. And if it does, I will say so. But based on what we have today, the preliminary report does not prove that the pilot deliberately brought the aircraft down. The switches came back to run, the relay sequence began, a Mayday call was made, the aircraft appears to have fought till the end, the impact attitude was nose up, the RAT timing still needs full explanation, the full cockpit voice transcript is not public, the report itself is preliminary, and the human cost of careless blame is already visible. So my position is simple. I'm not here to declare the final cause. I'm here to say this. The preliminary report does not prove pilot fault. And before we turn a dead pilot into a villain, the final report must answer the missing seconds. What happened first? Did the switches cause the engine power loss? Or did the aircraft already have a serious power problem before the switch event became the headline? This is the real question. A preliminary report should reduce speculation. But in this case, the way the information came out increased speculation. And the easiest target became the pilot, a man who cannot answer, a man who cannot explain what he saw, a man who cannot tell us what was happening in that cockpit. That is why the final report matters so much. Not just for Air India, not just for Boeing, not just for pilots, but for aviation safety, for you and me. Because if we blame the wrong thing, we learn the wrong lesson. And if we learn the wrong lesson, flying becomes less safe. So 1 year later, the mystery is still not fully over. The final report may answer it. And when it comes, we will go through it line by line. But until then, let's not turn missing seconds into someone's guilt. Let's wait for the evidence. Let's wait for the full sequence. Let's wait for the truth. This is Cockpit Confession, and this is my side of the story. Take care.